So good morning everyone, and welcome to the Better Frost Decisions webinar. For those of you who haven't already seen me or met me through Zoom or in live, I'm Michelle McClure from Southern Farming Systems. I'm our branch and event coordinator for Southwest Victoria. Today, who's joined me hosting the meeting is Jay Cummings, the project coordinator for Mallee Sustainable Farming. So Jay, if you could say good morning to everybody.
Yeah, good morning everyone, great to be here.
And Kelly Angel from BCG, she's the Senior Operations Manager there. Good morning, Kelly.
Morning, Michelle. Morning, everyone else.
So Jay, would you like to just give us a quick overview and purpose for this morning?
Yep, thanks Michelle. Certainly we're really grateful to Grdc to make it possible for supporting this fantastic initiative. It's a national program, and we're sort of looking after the southern region, and we've sort of given our project the subtitle Better Frost Decisions, in that it's a really quite a targeted extension and communications program that really aims to assist farmers in frost prone areas to make better informed decisions that will hopefully help them better manage and reduce the risk and impact from frost. So the actual Grdc investment is through the project applying current knowledge to inform grower decision making to mitigate the impact of frost now and in the future. So you can see why we've just given it the short snappy title of Better Frost Decisions anyway. So Mallee Sustainable Farming have been given the responsibility of implementing the project across the southern region. It's a short, sharp project that commenced in September and will be completed by June next year anyway. So the Better Frost Decisions recognises the strength of the local and regional farming systems networks, and it's great that Southern Farming Systems today are providing such a professional support to the actual delivery of this virtual frost field day. So being in COVID times, it'd be great to have the farmers out in the paddock, but given the restrictions, we're doing it virtually anyway. So as I mentioned, the real aim of the project is to provide farmers and advisors with the tools to identify and make better decisions in response to frost for this part of the actual season. And then what we'll be doing is we'll be building up to workshops next autumn so that farmers can be more proactive in terms of how they make use of the various tools, information, and importantly, farmer experience to actually implement better strategies. So that's about it in a nutshell. Michelle, back to you.
Thanks, Jay. I'll just bring up my screen again. So this morning I'll go through our session. So we'll just have a brief introduction to everybody, and then we'll go over to Kelly, who will go through identification and assessment of frost damage. Then we will have an interactive session where we can discuss local frost experiences in our areas. Has there been any frost this season? And if we have, what sort of degree has it been in your area? And then if a frost has occurred, we'll go through some immediate response strategies. If it hasn't, we'll just sort of skim over that and go through to reducing future risks. And then wrapping up with identifying future investment for GRDC in the frost research and management area. And then we'll have a wrap up. So I'm going to pass over to Kelly to give us an introduction to the identification and assessment of frost damage, and I'll stop sharing my screen, which I have. Over to you, Kelly.
Thanks, Michelle. I'll just bring this up. Presentation mode. Yeah, thanks, Michelle, for pulling this together, and to MSF for sort of putting the day together. I kind of focus this a little bit more on the higher rainfall zone, I guess, because of the leading group sort of bringing this discussion. So apologies probably to Darren and Tanya, I'll mix the two names together, There'll probably be a few crop types I don't touch on quite as much as others, but yeah, there is an immense amount of resources available to help with frost identification and that sort of thing, which I'll highlight those a little bit later on. So I'll get stuck into it. So I'm just going to cover a few photos from a few different crop types, mainly canola, faba beans and cereals, just looking at what some of the key damage might look like. And from some discussion with Michelle, my understanding is in those high rainfall zones, probably the key times that frost is an issue is more during the flowering and grain fill period as opposed to earlier timings. But I'll show you some of the stuff that we have experienced in our region, and it can get quite nasty earlier than those periods that seem to be the worst as well. Quick acknowledgement to Ben Biddulph. A lot of the photos you'll see within this document have sort of been produced from some of the resources pulled together as part of the National Frost Initiative. And I've also been on the phone to him a little bit, just trying to fine tune some of the discussion that has been raised by a few individuals around key discussion points. Grdc obviously for funding the work, and MSF and SFS for pulling the data together. So at what temperatures does frost occur? I guess the rule of thumb that we all generally work to is 2 degrees at screen temperature, and we could be starting to see issues with frost, and that's generally what we work to. I think the key things to keep in mind with this is that elevation is a massive function of this as well. Cold air behaves a lot like water, so what happens is you get frost damage, and those low-lying areas are the ones that get hit worse. So you might have 2 degrees at screen temperature, but if that screen happens to be located on a hilltop, the difference between that and what's happening at the crop, which commonly is sort of thought to be about 2 degrees cooler, can be a lot more than that. And we have seen times where even same elevation, that screen temp and the crop temperature at the canopy height has been up to 7 or 8 degrees difference in temperatures. So we do see quite a significant drop as we get closer to the canopy, and that's why the crop's so susceptible. One of the things that was also pointed out by a few is, what sort of makes frost worse at different times. And a rainfall event prior to a frosty overnight condition certainly is one of the things that can make things escalate quite quickly. The reason that happens is because within rain, we quite often have these things called ice nucleating bacteria, commonly of the Pseudomonas species. And what they do is they mean that the minimum temperature at which that water freezes actually increases. The level to which that happens is a bit varied and still a very big focus point for research, but it is commonly known and felt that rain does increase the damage function that comes from a frost event. The other thing to keep in mind is it's not just did a frost occur, it's about how cold did it get and how long did it last. So, if you're going to get -10, it's pretty common that you're going to see damage. It's not many things can tolerate that. But if you're going to get a -2, how long does it need to sit there to cause the damage? And those functions are not necessarily understood to the point that you can put some measures on it. You can't necessarily say -2 for 5 hours is the same as -4 for 2 hours. It doesn't quite work that easy. Most of you are probably aware that the susceptibility of the crop to frost damage increases as we approach flowering. Down those higher rainfall regions, you're probably more looking at those periods. I don't know if you can see my mouse when I move it around, can you or not? Yep. So you're probably seeing these sort of areas causing the most grief, but we have seen, particularly in the Mallee in 2014, anywhere from this area can get significant damage as well. And we've seen complete stem decimation of crops in a dry environment in the 31st to 32nd or first to second node stage. So we might have our peak windows around that flowering period and certainly is most sensitive then, but the window for frost damage is quite broad. So what do we want to look for in terms of crop damage? So I'll start with canola. A lot of these will be quite familiar to a number of people. We get this after a frost event. You can see it nearly instantly. The actual desiccation of the stem might not appear properly for a few days, but if you go out in the paddock after a frost event, you'll usually see the canola's got a bit of a crook shape to it on top of the crop. It's just suffered some freezing damage within the stem that's caused distortion. And then if that has been severe enough, it will sort of present itself where the stem completely dehydrates or desiccates, and the head above that point will start to die off. If we go a little bit later into the season during that sort of flowering and pod development stage, you'll notice here that you can't necessarily pick it up right at the flowering stage, but the result of a frost will present as these pods that fail to develop shortly after flowering. The good thing about canola, and we're all familiar with it, is that it's an indeterminate crop, flowers over a very long period. So this small section of damage here from a single frost event doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to have a significant yield decline, because we've still got these pods above it and the ones below it that are still progressing okay. Then over on the right hand side, just a bit of development, a bit of damage within the seed development stage. So you can see in the middle here, we've got a few seeds that are looking nice and healthy and green, very plump. But towards the end, we've had a grain frost that's meant that these seeds have been affected and they're not going to develop. They'll shrivel up to pretty much nothing. Pulling out faba beans, and I do apologise, pulse frost is probably not an area that I've worked in quite as much. So there may be people more experienced or knowledgeable on these areas. But some of the photos that have been presented in the frost identification guides do present this bending of the stem. A bit of damage has occurred and caused some weakness in the stem, and it's grown away from that. So obviously we're still getting some translocation of moisture and nutrients up the stem to allow it to continue to grow. We see during early or flowering and early pod development, you can get complete desiccation of that developing seed. And then through the grain development stages, you can see this shriveling. So we've got individual seeds here that have been lost because of frost damage. And then over here, you can see a pod that's severely affected and one that's just touched up a little bit. Moving on to some cereals, and this is where I've selected quite a range of growth stages. It probably is one of the most studied crops when it comes to frost. And so there is a lot of information out there about the timings that it can be affected and the type of damage functions that present. So this is sort of the damage that we can see about 2 to 3 weeks after a frost occurring at second node. On the right-hand side of this stem, I've lost my mouse function, here we go. So this stem here is nice, healthy looking. If you're looking at in the flesh or in the field, it would be nice and shiny and smooth. This stem here, you can see it's been significantly impacted by quite cold events, and these aren't the things that occur at a 0 degree event. If you think about what's happening in the development of the crop, it's quite a tough crop during those more vegetative or early reproductive stages. So this type of damage has occurred in 2014 within a trial when we were getting -5 at the screen temperature, and from tiny tags we're registering around -9 at the canopy height. If you were looking at this a little bit earlier, and it could be as early as 2 to 3 days after the event for a well-trained eye, you would see just above these nodes is usually where the damage presents itself. It'll be a little bit blistered, it'll be rough to touch, and they're the 2 key identifying characteristics to whether you've had an early stem frost damage. Roughness and quite a blistered appearance. In that same stage, so around that 1st to 2nd node, as the ear is starting to develop deep within the stem, we can also see death of the developing ear. So on this side here, the ear is nice and healthy. It's nice green coloration. It's got good structure to it. This head on the right-hand side here has been affected by frost at around second node, and you can see that the developing ear has completely dried off and it's not going to produce anything. And that stem will actually shut down production. The plant recognises that this isn't a viable option anymore, and it will redirect resources either into tillers that are producing well, or it may re-tiller, and we quite often see that in frosted crops, that will get re-tillering from the base as the crop recognises that these tillers are not sustainable. When we start to get to head emergence, this is the type of damage here that we might see. Missing florets that have been affected, particularly as the head's coming out of the boot. So in these cases, you might get a small rain event, or you might have some heavy dews that have sat within the leaf sheath that's protecting the head, and these florets down here have been knocked out. Sometimes it happens in the middle, sometimes it could be both ends. We've seen all sorts of combinations, but that's generally occurring during that heading stage, so from about 49 through to 60. And then this one is, I guess, our classic stem frost that we're probably more familiar with. We've got stem damage down this end, but this is where the peduncle, that little stem directly below the head, is affected. And quite often what happens here is, at this point would have been where the flag leaf sits, and we've either had a rain event or a dew, a significant frost overnight. It's frozen the tissue within the stem in this area, and we get this bleaching band. Now that bleaching doesn't mean that the head's not viable, and it's probably well illustrated here that these heads still look like they're going to produce something in some cases. If you think of the stem, it's like holding a bunch of straws together, and how severe the frost is will determine how many of those straws are damaged. So you may find that even though you're seeing this symptom, the crop can still translocate enough nutrients and moisture up to the head. You'll have other times, particularly in dry seasons, where the resources are not as readily available, and that ability to translocate those nutrients and moisture up to the head are far more restricted. One of the things that you can do, and it's not foolproof and it still needs follow-up investigation, but cut some of these stems off and stick them in some water with some food dye, and what you can see is that moisture getting past that point. Red's a good colour to use. Put it in, and if you're seeing red translocate up into the glooms of the head, gives you an indication that something can still get through. But definitely don't rely on that alone as a way to sort of see what your damage function's like. You need to keep monitoring that crop as well. Progressing a little bit further with wheat, and probably a similar function in barley, you know, we're starting to hit flowering at this stage. On this side here is a nice healthy wheat head. You can see the ovary down here looks nice and green and healthy. The stigma, which is the receptive part to the pollen to fertilise the grain, is fluffy, looks like it's in good condition. And your anthers here, your pollen source, they're a nice yellow colour when they're at that peak flowering stage. And the little stem that they're attached to is quite strong in its structure. Compared to this side here, you can see that the ovary is not particularly healthy. The stigma is very poor looking, quite reduced in size, definitely not looking receptive. And the anthers take on this really pale colour and a banana shape, indicating that that crop has been hit at a flowering stage and is going to struggle to fill those grain. Early grain development, we've got a nice healthy head here. You can see it's got a good greenish coloration, developing and pushing up through the spikelet or through the floret. Where over here, we've got a couple of grain that are producing quite nicely, but we've got these ones here that have been affected by an early grain fill frost, and they've stopped development. Quite often when you squeeze them early after the event, they'll be really watery, more so than you expect from a watery ripe stage. And they'll go a slightly grey colour, as you can see here. They don't look quite as healthy as these guys here or the ones developing here. As that plays out further, it can look like this final picture over on the the right-hand side here. So severely pinched grain, if it has developed a bit further, complete grain loss where it's been hit a little bit earlier. And then you guys have indicated that grain frost is a problem. So here we've got our nice healthy grain, and the two pictures to the right of it, you can see where a grain development frost has created shriveling and pinching of the grain, results in higher screenings. Can sometimes actually have a quality benefit. So it can sometimes be higher protein, but with your screenings being affected, quite often lower quality is the end result. And then just a few pictures of barley here. So I think I've seen one of these pictures floating around maybe from what's happening down in Tassie. This has been affected at that flowering stage, and what we end up with is these gaping florets trying to resource themselves to maybe produce something. They rely at this point on outcrossing, which is not probably a common fertilisation method for barley. They're more a self-crossing setup. So you get this gaping of the florets, and you hold them up to the light, you can see that real papery appearance. They become quite see-through. That starts to express itself further as these missing grain positions. Yeah, so that you've got distorted heads that are thick and thin. Developing grain could be anywhere in the head. Sometimes you might have a whole head affected and one grain will produce. Seen all sorts of combinations of that, which is not ideal compared to what we're really wanting to achieve here. And yeah, just a bit further developed there as well. So when and where to look? Where will you find this damage? Well, the most critical stages are around that ear emergence, flowering and early grain fill stage. That's when the crop's most susceptible. So if you're going to get frosty conditions where you're registering 2 degrees or below at screen temperature and have an understanding of your landscape, that's the time that's most critical. But as highlighted with the wheat, you can get damage earlier, and you can probably get damage a little bit later, but early grain fill's probably where it sort of cuts out. Temperatures below 2 degrees for a substantial time or under conducive conditions, so that rainfall factor can highlight a need to, sorry, we'll just go back one, highlight a need to pay a little bit of attention in those frost-prone areas. Those low areas that are affected, or anything that causes cold to pull back over the crop. So if you've got a substantial tree line on a hillside, you may occasionally experience frost on the upside of that, because as the cold air flows down the hill, it gets banked up by the trees that are there, which can cause frost damage in places that you might not necessarily expect it to be. And unfortunately, it can take 5 to 7 days to really notice what is or has happened. And there probably isn't a real short-term improvement on that in the pipeline just yet either. Plenty of things being tested, but nothing too concrete just yet. Best thing to do in terms of identification is resources, and the two in the middle there, the Frost Identification Guide for Cereals and for Canola and Pulses, have plenty of very clear pictures in it across a wide range of growth stages and across all crop types. So if you're looking to refine your skills on ID, these guides certainly have some good material in them, and some guidelines on what to look for. They are available online on the GRDC website, and I think MSF have got them linked to their Better Frost Decisions page on their website as well. And then, yeah, Ground Cover has a lot of articles linked to it. They have a whole section on frost management, which has videos and those sorts of things in it. And DPIRD, who has done a mountain of work in the frost space because of the risk that it poses to their systems over there, have a lot of information on their website as well. I think that will be where I stop there, Michelle, and I guess I'm happy to field any questions.
Thanks, Kelly. There is a couple of questions. There is often confusion on which temperatures to look at on weather data from, and is it the feels like temperature more relevant to a plant, or should we just be looking at the measured temperature?
I don't know whether there has been a lot that's been put into that. I guess the thing that I'd be wary of with the feels like temperature is it usually takes into account a wind chill factor. And one of the best things for breaking frost is a breeze. So I think the feels like temperature wouldn't really have a good fit in that sense, because we all know Ballarat and those southern areas, the actual temperature or the apparent temperature is 10 degrees, but it feels like -10 because they've thrown a bit of wind in the mix. So yeah, I would be probably not focusing too much on the feels like, because that's going to have a wind chill factor in it quite often as well.
Are there any further questions on particularly identification and assessment of frost damage from the audience? Feel free to type in the chat box or unmute yourself and ask Kelly direct. Okay. We'll keep moving along. Oh, hang on. Yep, no, everyone's very comprehensive, and yeah, some great pictures there that are very valuable, and I'm sure if we check out those resources online, you'll see all those things. I'll move on to our next session, talking about local frost experiences. I was lucky enough earlier this week to sit down with 2 agronomists and 1 local grower in the Streatham region. So Craig Drum from Diagro in Tadioon, and Jared O'Brien from Western Ag, and Miles Reid, the local grower. So I'm just recorded their little conversation about frost in their sections. So I'm just going to share this recording with everyone, and then we'll go into a discussion session where we can jot down some ideas and things like that. So I'll just share my screen. And I'll start playing the video.
I'm Miles Reid, cropper in the southwestern district of Caramballoch, and been home on the farm cropping for about 22 years.
Hi, I'm Jared O'Brien. I work as an agronomist at Western Ag Supplies based in Derrynallen. I've been there for 15 years, or pretty much since its inception. Prior to that, I was with Landmark at Skipton for 3 years, and in Ballarat a few years before that.
Craig Drum, agronomist out of Tadioon in southwest Victoria. Been down this part of the world for 12 years, and then before that 10 years in the Wimmera in Victoria.
Since I've been farming, we've had probably 1 severe frost every 10 years, and probably had a few touch-ups in different varieties and different timings of sowing. Over that 10 year, probably two hits in 10. So, but yes, it is an issue for us that we have to manage occasionally.
In 10s, probably gone close to 2 in 10 at times, but yeah, certainly some of them aren't as severe. But it's a risk every year. Depends on the topography, of course, and the seasonal circumstances.
Since we've been getting a few more frequent frosts the last few years on our lower country, we've had to putting in more infrastructure for handling hay, so it takes the stress out of it. If we do have to cut it, at least we can put it somewhere out of the weather and sit on it if we have to. And timing of sowing, with our program, it's just start sowing, we have to, but it would be nice, but in a bit smaller program, to be able to spread it out a bit if we could.
Probably the only other change on top of that, got a few guys in high risk areas that will grow a few more milling oats instead of wheat or barley. Definitely don't tend to be as prone to some frost. Hay's obviously set up for hay, definitely, as I agree with Miles, is definitely a role on that. And any real super high risk areas is to change that cropping type. So either a really, just make sure you avoid that risk. So you're sowing a revenue wheat maybe in June or July, and though you'll get heat at the other end, but definitely You know, those areas that are getting 6, maybe touched up 6 or 7 times out of 10. So really high risk areas, taking that real risk out.
Yeah, well, I certainly endorse that, Tommy. But yeah, also on the canola side, you either do or you don't like them. But the use of the winter types, because they are so late flowering, that if you do have a suspect area, or one that's been prone to be frosted in the past, that's probably a good alternative. You can look at it, there's 2 times you can be frosted, either a flowering frost or a grain development frost. And personally, I think our worst frosts are the grain development ones. So probably the 17 one was about the 8th of November from memory. So yeah, quite late. So yeah, not very often do we see the significant flowering frost, sorry.
Got a paddock or a block on the farm that actually a lot higher frequency of frost. We do need to manage those blocks differently. There's no point to keep doing the same thing in those areas. So whether it be a different crop type or change something that.
Yeah. I think also it depends on the individual case. Like if a grower say has hay sheds and facilities and has the willingness to want to do hay, you can sort of minimise your risk there by saying, okay, potentially we could get frosted, but we'll do our best to grow the biggest crop we can so that we can maximise the high hay yield. But if you've got a grower that just detests hay, doesn't have the capacity to do it, then yeah, you've obviously got to do a different management strategy for that grower.
When we got smoked in 2017, we didn't realise how little moisture the plant could survive on. And it looked very good, the crops looked sensational, but there was very little moisture down below, and they were obviously more stressed than we realised. Because when we got frosted in the 08 year, the worst parts of our paddocks were the headlands, where we'd double sow on everything, where we'd overlapped, and if you walked past that point on the headland and into the main part of the paddock, it wasn't frosted. So in that year we just cut the headlands, which were completely smoked, where they've been moisture stressed. Compared to the rest of the paddock, which we let go and got our 5.5 tonne, which was unbelievable considering how bad the headlands were. So, yeah, moisture stress.
I think I'd like to see a bit more data in length of temperatures. So, how long it's below 0 for, and we'd expect what sort of damage, and how long below -2 or -3. That's number one. I think there'd be some data out there starting to show us there. I've no doubt there is a little bit of variety at times, so probably a little bit of that. But the other one about 17, which I was unaware of, and until after that happened, is that effect of that shower of rain we had on that Friday night, and then the frost afterwards, and so that data's come out of Europe and out of WA and been out for 8 or 9 or 10 years, and none of us were aware of it. Now, it wouldn't have made any difference between management. And yes, we started seeing the damage 4 days later, so it probably wouldn't have made any difference there, but we were sort of wondering why we went so quick and why it was so severe, and it wasn't until afterwards that we found out that 2 or 3 mil on dark or just after dark, and then the cloud went and she came, that I think it was a main contributing factor. It was cold, but it was not -5 or -6 or -7. It was a good frost. It wasn't a humdinger considering it. It took out hundreds of millions of dollars out of the district in a couple of nights.
Something else that may be a little bit left of field, but there's a few companies out there now with these biological stimulants. They're all running around independently saying, we'll mitigate some stress, but it's yet to be proven. But you take it to someone like Grdc to try and prove it, and as you said before, Drummond, to try and get a year where you're going to get a frost, and you could do the work for 5 years and you may not get a result. But certainly there's a few things out there, but certainly nothing proven. And I think the other thing too would be if you could shorten the period from when it was frosted to make a decision. So I don't know whether you could measure the sugar levels or something like that. If there's a significant increase in sugar levels, I've got no idea. But whether there was some sort of quick test, because really you do have to wait 7 days to get a clear picture.
Or the other one is they are doing work with imagery, aren't they? So that's what I'd love to see a bit more of the work of that done if we could get an image.
Yeah.
Because you get a good frost, normally get a good sunny day. They are, you know, in a few days.
Quite an intense period, like when you've got a client base and you've had significant frost and everyone wants them looked at that day, and it nearly becomes impossible. So if there was a tool to help you out, it'd be fantastic.
Technology. Thank you to Miles and Jared and Craig for that chat. It was really great, and it just proves what Kelly has alluded to, that it's not just temperature, there's other factors involved in frost, which makes it very hard for research and everyone to work through it. So if I can get everyone to just now unmute, because we want to have a bit of a discussion around this, and I'll put up my little slideshow that I'm hoping to get. I'd just like people to maybe chime in and have a discussion about their local experiences, the conditions that they've experienced frost in, was there hot spots, yeah, where's the high risk, and the yeah, different experiences. So anyone like to unmute and go first?
Yeah, I'll start if you like, Michelle.
Yep. Thanks, Brett.
I actually found that really interesting, because experiences the gentleman was just talking about is exactly what we've seen recently. We've had we had strings of multiple -3 degree frosts in August. We had -3s at the start of September. We didn't see any damage at all. A couple of weeks ago, we had a -1.5. Now, keep in mind that this is in the bomb weather station that's only about 1 kilometre away. I think the temperature sensors on the bomb is 1.2 metres, I think. So our crop height's a bit lower than that. But we had a rain event. We had a rather muggy, warm day, probably 16 degrees or something. That's quite warm for us to have rain. We had that on the Thursday. It rained through until about 11 o'clock that night. And we had a frost event the next day, which was 0.5 of a degree. And we've actually had whole ears cut. And we actually had ears cut that were only just emerging out of the leaf sheath as well. Thankfully enough that these were all in trials, and due to the frost damage that we get, most of the farmers down here plant later and plant longer season varieties, because we're too susceptible through the September and October period for any early maturing crops. Our canola was hit pretty hard, but the lovely long season down here and the rainfall through into December will actually make sure the canola keeps going. The main one's cereals.
Thanks, Brett. Anyone else like to add in or give any information to Brett?
I guess in terms of the frost event and the barley damage, that rain event is probably the critical tipping point there. If you've got barley heads that are just at that ear emergence stage, you've pretty much created that beautiful little channel to filter rainfall down into that head area. So that rain would get down in there, carrying with it these ice nucleating bacteria. And so even though the temperature at the weather station level hasn't been quite so cold, all the stars have aligned to create a fairly significant event in that crop type at that time. So yeah, it sort of goes with the science that everything, yeah, unfortunately has lined up at the same time.
Yes, and that's been the thing that we've sort of noticed I mean, certainly those 0708 events that Miles quickly referred to in the video, and Jared also talked about where we were all just sitting on windrows going from paddock to paddock. We all thought that was because of, well, it was because of lack of moisture. They were fairly tough years in Western Victoria, but the one in November, as Jared referred to on the 8th of November, was really an anomaly to all of us. We all didn't know about what you've just told us, Kelly, with regard to that. And that was the heartbreaker, because everybody thought they were there. And I suppose what Southern Farming Systems have also been wanting to work on, and we've got a few drought decision-making things in the pipeline at the moment about decision-making, and just as importantly about decision-making when you're not under stress. And as Miles fairly quietly said, there is no greater stress than coming under stress from frost. And, you know, we believe, and that's why I like Miles's aspect in the video, that it's hugely important that people make these decisions when they're calm and they're feeling happy and they're whatever. And Miles clearly has said that he has less stress because he has a second fiddle to the thing and he is set up to do hay. And just as importantly for an organisation like Southern Farming Systems, the biomass of various crops at various times also assists people to make those decisions as profitably as they can. So there's really two aspects here. One is making the decisions when you're in the right frame of mind, and just as importantly, having some fallback positions that you know you can go to, because that gives lots of farmers a lot more sleep and they're not waking up in the middle of the night. But I reckon it was a great video, really well done.
Brett, if you're still there, the topography of where the trial site is, because we're all not familiar with Tasmania, would you be hot? Is it up on top of the hill or are you down in the gully?
The trial is actually down next to a river, so we're probably 150 metres away from a river, so it's sort of a floodplain. So it is rather low-lying area. And goes up in the higher top paddocks are actually mainly pasture, but it is low lying. I'm probably 25 metres lower than the weather station that recorded the temperature as well.
Kelly, have you got anything to add about topography and
Yeah, just adds to the story, I guess. 25 metres, there's no hard and fast rule on what that temperature difference is, but if you look at the general rule of thumb between screen height and canopy height being 2 degrees, and you're looking at maybe, you know, less than a metre difference between those two heights. If you suddenly add a 25 metre difference in temperature, it would have been interesting to know what the temperature down near the river was, because that ½ degree measured on the weather station is probably going to be closer to your -7, -8 down on the flat. So that's a significant difference in temperature. And yeah, we all know the rivers are where they are because everything drains there. So the cold air is no doubt cooled there as well.
And I have actually got a logging weather station at the trial site, so I'll be interested to see when I can get some data from it, what it actually went down to, because that has got temperature sensors at crop height.
Yep.
I might just add something, whether it's an experience. It's just going off what Scott was talking about emotions, and just the weather stations that growers have actually allowed them to make a decision based on data, and taking that emotion out of it, I suppose. Like if you know you've had 3 severe frosts in a row at a susceptible time, that the decision's made with the data. So rather than waiting a week and checking crops every day, that's the big difference I've found between clients is, if you've got local information like that, the decision is based like it's an economic numbers decision rather than, oh, I wanted to harvest that, I've got a new header or something like that. So yeah, just one thing I've noticed.
And you can all see my bad typing when I do this.
Yeah, I think that weather station and local knowledge of what's going on is a good thing. And it probably applies more to those areas that have flatter landscapes, and Darren could maybe well talk to this as well through that Kalkee Plains area. But yeah, we have had growers sort of say, if I did it based on the temperature in that environment, I could have well made the wrong choice, because being such a flat landscape around there, the damage function is not always well correlated with temperature. There's all the other factors that kick in as well, such as moisture availability, other aspects of crop health. Yeah, just phase of rotation, growth stage of the crop, all those sorts of things. So yeah, what do you think, Darren, on that? If you're still on there, would that be a fair assumption in those more challenging landscapes?
Yeah, definitely, Kelly. And topography is a huge one as well. Yeah, yeah.
Michelle, one of the real interesting things that came out of 2017 was, I know it was a pretty severe frost in terms of damage, but how many high spots it did actually get affected. And it seemed to be, as Mick Faulkner says, you know, the frost and the cold air will flow like water. And we had quite a few high spots that were on tops of hills that normally don't get frost. Well, you know, the frost damage is not as bad, but they weren't gradual slopes. They were quite steep hills, and so the valley in between was not that deep, for want of a better word, and it was able to creep. Felt like it was able to really creep up the hill a fair way. Whereas the guys that were on slow, gentle slopes, they might have been at the same height above sea level, but their damage was not as great as the guys that were potentially on tops of hills, where the valleys were, you know, the hills were quite steep and then roll back down the other side.
Seems like it was a real, yeah, it must have been a real sudden freeze for it to sort of rush up a hill, like a bit like a fire.
I think the key there is, and the functions in our environment are a little bit different, but it's not right to rule out frost upslope. Topography is certainly an important part, but there's other aspects that can sort of hinder that as well. If you think to the West Wimmera, some of those areas have got white sands interspersed, and that probably happens the same in the SA regions too, I'd imagine, Tanya, but those white sands can be quite conducive to far lower temperatures than the heavy vertisols that may surround them. And so what you'll have is these pockets of frost that make no sense when you look at topography, but when you start to understand the other drivers to that temperature difference, you start to find out that, yeah, there's a lot at play, there's a lot going on, and just that highly reflective nature of that white sand means that it cools down quicker overnight, and it also absorbs less heat through the day.
Another thing, maybe an experience in 2017, which I know was one out of the box, but just the timing of that decision to cut hay was crucial as far as, firstly, quality, but also just getting contractors and things like that. So again, it's, yeah, I think that really makes or breaks. Like if you're going to cut, make that decision as soon as you can and just own it, rather than, you know, again, 2017, a lot of people were cutting areas of paddocks and then ended up averaging 200 kilos per hectare of grain in the areas that they didn't cut. So, which has, yeah, put a big mark on their long-term gross margin.
I think you make a really good point there. 2017 probably taught everyone how bad it can be at the wrong time, and we probably got as severe frost event in 2018, but everyone was ready to make those decisions at that point. I think 2017, all the growers are looking at their crops going, this is the best crop I've grown in quite a few years. and weren't ready to believe it was frosted. Whereas 2018 rolled around, everyone was ready to cut hay, 4, 5, 6 days after the major frost event, which is a week later, just because they'd been through that difficulty of 2017. So it probably helped that 2017 taught a lot of people, although they were bad lessons to learn, they still learned those lessons very well for the following year.
Yeah, I agree. And the hay price did help too. But even the low hay price in 2017, as Miles said in the video, like if you've got storage, like that actually ended up being one of the most profitable, I guess, crops or rotations in the last 5 years, is the hay cut in 2017 and sold in 2018. So it's hay sheds, high biomass crops and hay sheds are probably the best way to manage frost risk.
Very well said. We got any more discussion?
Also, guys, as a general rule of thumb, when we do get bad frosting years, it's generally pretty easy making hay because we generally have the dry weather as well. So that's why hay doesn't scare us as much anymore. We generally get pretty good weather with those shitty frosty years that we've had in the past. So we can get the hay in the bale and the hay in the shed, which is half the battle.
Absolutely. One of the other really long-term, and Annika's just tempted us to talk about long-term gross margins and 10-year periods and things, is that one of the other options, if the hay market isn't fantastic, is to cut for silage and put underground. In any sort of mixed farming operation, it can be a very good option. And I suppose because I'm thinking nationally rather than just Southwest Victoria, that's also a fantastic option for New South Wales areas and whatever coming out of drought if they suddenly get frosted, because you can start to put in a wedge of long-term feed storage that you mightn't use for 10 years, but in the year you use it, it can make you a lot of money or save you a lot of money. So yeah, certainly the hay is the best option in Southwest Victoria, but long-term silage is certainly an option in other areas of Australia.
And I think certainly New South Wales learned that in 2018 when things were going very much against them. They made some really good quality silage out of their canola crops where they took a chance very early. Probably just at flowering, and they probably made a lot more money by going early and having a crack and making silage, which was actually really high quality, and all the stock farmers loved it. So that was probably brought about by the 2017 that you've got to make those decisions early, and then you make the best of those decisions.
Absolutely.
I think that takes us through to our next session with Kelly about reducing future risks and developing those further long-term strategies, which we've touched on a bit. So I'll stop sharing my screen and hand back to Kelly.
No worries, thanks, Michelle. Just bring it up again. On the right side. So I guess the first thing I just want to point out with sharing this today is that this session today is part of a series, and I guess a lot more of this information will be covered in more detail in what is sort of planned for early next year, which is, I guess, some hopefully face-to-face sessions where we start to unpackage the range of tools available and what they mean and how they work. So this is pretty much a snapshot of what some of them might be, with a little bit of detail in terms of some of the key ones. But yeah, it probably won't present, or I won't be presenting a huge amount of data and that sort of thing. I've already done enough death by PowerPoint, so I'll spare you any more of that. So one slide and I'll just work through it. basically what has come out of a lot of the frost research is what we've called a toolbox. Everyone uses it for different management strategies. There would be toolboxes for every agronomic package available. But what we've broken it into is the big tools, the little tools, and the tools that are still under evaluation. So the big tools is probably something we've covered a little bit through the videos and through the discussion we've just had. And it all evolves around frost zoning and knowing what your risk is and applying enterprises or end users that suit the zone. So we've been talking about hay. You know, if you've got a paddock that gets hit every year, maybe trying to grow grain is not the best option. Maybe you need to look at whether it should be a grazing paddock or whether hay is a better option. It doesn't fit all the time. You'll have people that don't like hay. They don't want the equipment or the headache that comes with it or the work, whatever it may be. But it certainly is probably the biggest lever you've got if you've got areas that continually get hit by frost. The next thing that we've got, it's got variety by time of sowing, but it probably is more thinking about what are the varieties you've got in your system and optimising the time of sowing to suit the variety. So, you know, you talk about having a program that you have to have a start date because your logistics needs to fit. We all know the penalties that come with sowing too late. So how can you manipulate your variety and time of sowing package to make sure that you spread your risk as well as possible? And whether for the high rainfall zones, you're probably all using quite long season varieties anyway, but whether there's opportunities to manipulate that a bit if you maybe don't have the best system in place. The third one in the big tools is crop type. Generally speaking, oats are more tolerant than barley, which is more tolerant than wheat, if we look at those three as a cereal sort of standpoint. And there's usually about a 2-degree tolerance difference between them. One of the things we have noticed a little bit in recent times, however, is we do seem to get quite a lot of damage in oats at times. And that's largely driven by that Pseudomonas bacteria. So what causes stripe blight in oats is the same bacteria that causes ice nucleation, or the same family of bacteria that cause ice nucleation. So what they're finding is if we've got that bacteria within, whether it's come in on the seed or it's sort of developed over time in the crop, what we're finding is that those crops can be more susceptible to frost damage, but it's hard to tease the two apart. When we look at other crops, indeterminate flowering type crops can be a little easier to manage. Canola and faba beans are probably the ones that sit at the top of that list as being most tolerant to frosty regions. And then probably the worst two would be peas and chickpeas. So there is the crop type differences that we can play with. I heard a mention on variety differences. I guess it depends on the level of frost you're getting. The National Variety Trials online website has what's called the frost performance values on there. And what they've done is a heap of work over multiple times of sowing, looking at basically how well varieties tolerate a flowering frost. The important thing to know is there is no tolerance. There's a difference in sensitivity. If you're going to get a -10, -8 frost, it doesn't matter what variety you've got. If it's at that sensitive stage, it's going to get hurt. But there is, you know, at those not quite so severe temperatures, a little bit of variation within varieties. But variety doesn't sit in big tools. It sits under little tools and probably is a last resort in terms of frost management. Yeah, use your bigger levers if you've really got issues. The little tools have aspects like stubble management. I don't know how it works in your region. I'd be happy to hear what the story is with how stubbles are managed in high yielding environments. But some of the work had indicated that stubble can increase the severity and duration of frost events. The research is starting to shift a little in that space. It was thought that the stubble has a predominant impact on soil heat banks, that it reduces the amount of heat captured in the soil that then can be radiated at night to protect the crop. But what they're finding is that there may still be this Pseudomonas or ice nucleating bacteria story. And a lot of work has been going on in WA in that space, trying to nut out a bit more of the detail around, is it the stubble itself, or is it the stubble and presence of this bacteria, and what systems does that occur in more predominantly? Because we've had trials that sort of answer the question two ways. We've had ones that have said stubble has increased frost damage and decreased temperature, and then there's been other situations where it hasn't been quite so clear cut. Nutrition's always a big discussion point when it comes to frost, and a lot of talk in some of the more medium to, and I imagine high rainfall areas, is particularly around nitrogen. It was thought that nitrogen softens a crop, and a fair bit of work has gone into that space. There's still a need to understand whether it influences sugar concentrations within the plant and changes those finer details in terms of frost tolerance. But what they're thinking the key story with nitrogen is, and particularly well-nutritioned crops, is that they become quite synchronized in the way that they develop. And so what happens is, if you think of a crop that doesn't get fed very well, the tillers are all at slightly different stages. The crop is not as tabletop in its appearance, all that sort of thing. When you have a high nitrogen crop that's been managed to maximise yield potential, as we want to do, you actually increase the synchronisation of that crop. So rather than having a spread of tiller development over a period of a few days, you narrow it down to maybe just a couple of days. And what happens is, if you get a frost event on those days, the whole crop is at that sensitive stage at the same time. So you don't get that slight variation in crop development. In terms of potassium and then some of the micronutrients, the key place where they work is where you've got a problem. So yes, they can offer benefits in terms of stress tolerance, but if you've already got ample levels of any of those nutrients, luxury amounts don't improve performance in terms of frost tolerance. So if you don't have a potassium problem, adding more potassium is not going to get frost tolerance. If you don't have a copper problem, adding more copper is not going to improve frost tolerance. And then I guess the last little tool is grazing. It's probably not a preferred option all the time, because the length of time to graze a crop doesn't necessarily shift development enough to get it out of a frost window. So the work in WA has sort of looked at grazing twice as long as you want to shift your phenology. You're probably only wanting to graze for a couple of weeks, and you're wanting to try and target as close to that stem elongation stage to get the maximum benefit. But obviously you don't want to take out that growing point because you're ultimately taking away your yield before you even worry about frost risk. So it probably isn't a big step in terms of what it offers in shifting phenology, at least in the environments where it's been tested. And then some of the tools that there's been a fair bit of work and some benefits, but again, trying to attribute it just to frost is maybe not so clear cut. But soil amelioration, WA is using soil amelioration for numerous other reasons other than frost, but they're finding greater frost tolerance, probably a strong link to water availability and crop development in that space, so reducing its moisture stress, which is meaning it's tolerating the desiccation effects that frost causes a little better. Talked about the nitrogen management story. And then seeding rate, is another thing that some people have played with. Again, trying to manipulate soil heat bank, but it comes at the expense of a risk of increased weed pressure and also yield penalties, because particularly for you guys where you're targeting that top or that higher end yield, you wouldn't want to be compromising your plant numbers to try and mitigate frost for that purpose. They're probably the key tools in the tool bank. It's the kind of material that would be gone through in more detail in those February, March meetings. But I guess, is there any questions on any of that or any specific areas that people would like covered?
It's Jay here. I think that that's really a great wrap up, Kelly, and I really love that diagram in that it really provides a really good summary of what the key sort of options and opportunities are. So that's, yeah, a fantastic summary.
Well, I'll stop sharing, Michelle, and you can take it back then.
I'll move along. Jay, would you like to continue on talking about identifying properties for GRDC investment?
Yeah, thanks for that, Michelle. Certainly, we're really keen to hear from growers and agronomists in terms of, well, where do they think that the GRDC should direct future investment into frost management? Is further research needed, or is it sort of making information more accessible to farmers and agronomists and that sort of thing? So people can either sort of type in their suggestions now just into the chat box, or alternatively, we've got a small survey that we'll be distributing after this particular workshop anyway. So if there's any immediate ideas people have got, feel free to share them with us in the closing minutes of the workshop anyway. Michelle, I might just share my screen and just look at some of the actual resources that are available on our little website.
No worries. Get your screen up. There's been, yeah, a quick test for farmers and agronomists to use after a frost event. And I think, yeah, it's a tool that will take lots of different organisations to work on and come to. But yeah, it would be great and it would take the stress out of it too. If you could go out after that event and do a quick test to see what's happening.
Yeah. So, Michelle, I've got a little technical difficulty here anyway, just with my Zoom setup. So I won't actually worry about sharing the screen at this stage, but what we can do is provide participants with the link to the Better Frost Decisions, the resources that are available on the actual site. So you would have seen that Kelly provided some excellent examples of some of the information resources that are available that have been put together by GRDC and others. So there's links to those on the Better Frost website. Also, we've got some additional grower case studies, and these are just short videos where growers from a range of different areas share their experiences in relation to frost and what their thoughts are in relation to future GRDC investment. And also there's some excellent grower videos from previous projects that Kelly brought to our attention that once again provides further background examples of how growers actually manage frost and what their experiences are as well. And I think you'll find that the greatest value is gathered through farmers sharing their experiences with each other as well. So, yeah, thanks for that, Michelle. You're a true gem. So
there's the website, and we'll send you the link to the website.
Yep.
I'll just keep scrolling down.
Yeah. Yep.
So there's the video library.
Yep. And just a quick point. It's really great, the video that you produced, Michelle, with the guys there, and I think it's a good example of making use of technology, but just sort of sharing the practical experiences and that sort of thing. So it's pretty important in these sort of COVID times where we are sort of limited in terms of our mobility, but the other advantage is just the ability for us to get access to this information without having to leave our farm gate, so to speak, anyway. So once again, a terrific effort from Southern Farming Systems, and it was great with the participants sharing their ideas and experiences in that regard anyway. So that's sort of all from me anyway. So I suppose back to you, Michelle, if there's any sort of final questions or comments from people.
Just to say to you, Joe, that yes, we're only doing what our members have asked us to do. That is that they aren't into face-to-face field days as much anymore, that they haven't got the time to do that, that they've agronomists to go to them, but more importantly, they want things that they can look at on phone screens while they're on auto steer and doing various things. So we've responded to our member base, and time has been on our side because we've been able to deliver everything we've delivered this year on screens, because that's what our members wanted, and I think that's what generally farmers want. Yes, for those that want to dig deeper and go to websites and look at other stuff, they can do that as well. But you know, our farmer groups, our modern farmers want to be able, still want to access all this information, but they want it delivered in a way that they can watch it anywhere. And that's why it's fantastic that Kelly and Michelle have been so good at this year. And COVID's proved that, and we will continue to deliver this way as long as we're adequately funded to do it. And I would, on behalf of Southern Farming Systems, like to thank everybody that has contributed today. Kelly, your photos and presentations were excellent and clear, precise, not too much photo. That's what people want. So thank you all. And obviously thank you to Miles and Drummy and Jared for their bit of time, and Michelle yet again. You know, you have delivered what we need to deliver. So thank you.
Thank you. So that pretty much wraps us up for today's session. If you have any last dying questions to ask Kelly or anyone else in the room, feel free to do so. You have all been sent an email with a feedback evaluation survey link. So please, can you complete that survey for us? It helps us write our funding reports and push forward ideas for investment and future projects and workshops. So if you can please complete that, it won't take you very long out of your day. And also that link to the website was also in the email. This has been recorded, so we will be distributing the recording next week with a few minor edits to it, just to make it a bit easier to watch around the second time. But yeah, if that's all, thank you to everyone for joining us this morning.